In December of 1967, Paul McCartney brought the entire Beatles team together to finally watch the finished cut of his passion project, the movie Magical Mystery Tour. Unfortunately for Paul, this first screening did not go as planned. According to band manager Peter Brown, the reaction was unanimous. It was awful. It was formless, disconnected, disjointed, and amateurish. I told Paul to junk it. So what? We lost 40,000, I said. Better to junk it than to be embarrassed by it. But Paul's ego wouldn't let him consider this. He was positive that Magical Mystery Tour would be as warmly greeted by the public as all the Beatles products that came before it. It was not. Welcome to part 2 of the making of Magical Mystery Tour. Since Sgt. Pepper's release on June 1st, 1967, the Beatles have spent most of their days wandering aimlessly in an LSD-induced haze. Most recently, at John's behest, they traveled to Greece in the middle of a right-wing military coup in order to purchase an island where they would all live together in a communal, drug-fueled paradise. Suffice to say, that didn't work out. The Beatles embrace change. In fact, they direct it. But things are about to change far more dramatically than they or anyone near them could ever have predicted. A couple weeks prior, George had flown with Patty to Los Angeles, where he met with his spiritual mentor, Ravi Shankar. It was while in Los Angeles that Patty first read of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a man who promised, through the power of transcendental meditation, true spiritual bliss. So when George and Patty returned to England and saw that the Maharishi was hosting a clinic at the Hilton Hotel in London, George invited the rest of the Beatles to join. They were immediately hooked, especially John and George, and they all made the decision to travel to Bangor the very next day, where they would attend the Yogi's retreat. In Bangor, the Beatles decided that their drugged-out days were over. All they needed was meditation. That was the only thing that could bring about true bliss. And it was also here at the retreat where they would hear the news. Brian Epstein had died, specifically of a drug overdose.
It's hard to think of things to say, but he was just a beautiful fella, you know, and it's terrible.
What are your plans now?
Well, we haven't made any, you know. I mean, we only just heard, haven't we?
This was not just the death of a band manager, but a mentor, a friend, the one who had recognized the Beatles' brilliance and poured every resource he had into bringing them forward into the light. It was a substantial and life-altering loss. If that all seemed a little more short-winded than usual, it is because I made a narrative decision to cover the Beatles' introduction to the Maharishi and Brian Epstein's death in my part 1 of the Making of the White Album video. So if you would like to learn even more about it and the emotional impact it had on the band, you can find the link in the top right corner. The high was finally over. They were on their own now, with no idea what to do. On the 1st of September, all 4 Beatles would come together at Paul McCartney's house on 7 Cavendish Avenue to discuss their future without Brian Epstein. And it was made abundantly clear who would spearhead the band's efforts from this point: Paul. For him, this was not a moment to indulge in the shell shock, to wade in the mud. His message to the rest of the Beatles was clear. We have to keep our momentum. And of course, he wanted to channel that momentum into his next big idea, a film of his own creation, Magical Mystery Tour. Present at the meeting was publicist Tony Barrow, and it is his writing we will now share, describing the meeting that took place. In the midst of this surreal scenario, Paul came forward with his own very feasible solution to John's indecision. He proposed that the Beatles should embark immediately upon the making of Magical Mystery Tour. My colleagues condemned him for acting callously, but Paul explained his motives to me very convincingly. If most of the Beatles clear off to India now with the Maharishi, I doubt if we'll come together again as a working band. The last thing we need now is time on our hands to brood about Brian's death. He felt that throwing themselves into filming would keep the four guys together until they could plan their long-term future with clearer minds. I didn't get the impression that Paul was any less affected by Brian's death than the others were. It just seemed to be the way he coped with loss, accepting what had happened and trying to be practical about it. In fact, years later, he reacted in a similar way to the horrific news of John's murder. Looking back on it all these years later, it's obvious that Paul saw a vacancy in leadership after Brian died, and he stepped in. Perhaps that ultimately led to the band's breakup, but the fact of the matter is that someone had to. As I see it, Paul saved the band. And with that, it was full steam ahead. John's I Am the Walrus is a surrealist spectacle and one of his masterpieces. Tracking down the exact origin of the song's creation is difficult. According to John,
first line written on one acid trip one weekend, second line written on the next acid trip the next weekend, and subsequently filled in after I met Yoko.
Which, if this is true, would date the song's origin back to late 1966. But even if this is true, the song would not come together fully for quite some time later.
I was running through the house and I just typed on the typewriter, I am here, you are here, we're all together. And that was lying on the typewriter for about 3 weeks before it became a song. That was the whole song right in that line. You know?
John was apparently very inspired by Procol Harum's A Whiter Shade of Pale, released at the peak of John's LSD use, and undoubtedly his favorite song of the period.
As the ceiling flew away.
Beatles biographer Hunter Davies was there when the song's writing was finished in August, sometime before their trip to Bangor, when John's longtime friend Pete Shotton came by for a visit. John asked Pete about a playground nursery rhyme they had sung as children.
I had to add all that garbage about yellow matter custard and all that, which is an English children's chant. Yellow matter custard, green snot pie, all mixed together with the dead dog's eye. Spread it on a butty, which is a sandwich, spread it on thick, then wash it down with a cup of cold sip.
Let the fuckers work that one out, John said to Pete as he wrote. Of the song's structure, musicologist Ian MacDonald would write that the song was the most unorthodox and tonally ambiguous sequence he ever devised. An obsessive musical structure built around a perpetually ascending/descending MC Escher staircase of all the natural major chords.
It was Walrus and the Carpenter.
The what?
The Walrus and the Carpenter, Alice in Wonderland.
But the recording of the song began like any other. The Beatles recorded 16 takes of basic rhythm track on this day, only 5 of them to completion. And the incredible mix of bizarre elements had not yet been added to the pot. Paul's The Fool on the Hill dates back to at least March of 1967, when Paul first played John the melody during the recording of With a Little Help from My Friends. The lyric was not to be completed until later. If Paul is correct in his recollection that, I think I was writing about someone like Maharishi. His detractors called him a fool. Because of his giggle, he wasn't taken too seriously. It was this idea of a fool on the hill, a guru in a cave. If he's correct, then this lyric must have been very recent, seeing as the Beatles only became exposed to the Maharishi in August. On this day, Paul taped just the demo of the song, all on his own, accompanied by piano.
To him, they can see that he's just a fool.
They then tackled overdubs for I Am the Walrus, including Paul's bass line, more drums from Ringo, and John's brilliant, searing vocal.
See how they run like pigs from a gun, see how they fly. I'm crying.
The last track tackled for the day was George's Blue Jay Way. The song was written sometime in early August, when George and Patty were in Los Angeles visiting Derek Taylor. The title of the song came from a street named Blue Jay Way, where George had rented a house for his stay. He began writing the song at a Hammond organ, while he and Patty waited for Derek Taylor and his wife, Joan, to join them. The home's location, on a hillside of narrow, winding roads, together with the foggy conditions that night, created the backdrop for the song's opening lines.
There's a fog upon LA, and my friends have lost their way.
By the time Derek arrived, 2 hours late, the song was just about written. They taped just one very basic recording of the song this night.
Please don't be long. Please don't you be.
It was now time to work on vocals for Blue Jay Way. George's vocals were treated with ADT, which I haven't covered yet on this channel, surprisingly. Basically, it was an early form of doubling the vocal. ADT, artificial double tracking. This is one of many studio inventions that came about at the behest of the Beatles and their specific demands, though the credit goes to their engineering team, who devised the technique. John specifically applied ADT to his vocals more than anyone else.
Cellophane flowers of yellow and green. Cellophane flowers of yellow and green.
Partially because of his undue insecurity in the sound of his voice. We'll cover the invention in detail when we get to the making of Revolver. But this is how it worked. A vocal is duplicated through the use of two separate tape machines, where then the copied vocals played back at a slightly slower speed on the second machine, creating a very slight, distinct delay. The two vocals are then layered on top of each other. Next for the song came the backing vocals, which were also mixed uniquely, so as to give them that psychedelic feel.
Please don't be long. Please don't you be very long. Please don't be long.
These were run through a Leslie speaker cabinet, just as John's lead vocal had been for Tomorrow Never Knows. And these same backing vocals were also played backward throughout the song. The Beatles rarely attempted fully instrumental recordings, and they had not last done so since Rubber Soul with 12-bar original, which was never released, but Magical Mystery Tour required some incidental backing music, and so the four came together for the purpose of creating just that. Originally called Aerial Tour Instrumental, it was later renamed Flying, and was the first song to be credited to all four Beatles. The first recordings of the song were quite different, and included some very prototypically jazzy saxophone. On take 6, they introduced 3 organs, which were recorded and then played backwards. Finally, John added some mellotron, and then the Beatles recorded their chanting vocals, so I guess it isn't technically a purely instrumental song. And then, on the 11th, the big day had finally arrived. It was time to actually film Magical Mystery Tour. We will now flash back to April of this year, when Paul arrived back from America with the movie idea in his head. He sent Tony Barrow off in search of a very brightly colored coach to serve the titular role in the film. So Tony and his wife set off to Eastbourne on England's south coast, where the weather was dreadful for the entirety of their search. It was from their hotel window, one fateful Sunday morning, when Tony just happened to spot the perfect coach pull into the hotel parking lot. He rushed into the pouring rain, thinking to himself, "I've found it." I assume that he simply told the coach's owner that the Beatles would like to hire it for a very fair price. Who could say no to that? When filming began on Monday, Paul decided that the tour should begin at London's Allsop Place, where the Beatles themselves had waited for the bus to take them out on cross-country concert tours in their early days as a performing act. Paul arrived at 10:30 to find that most of the actors and extras had already arrived, though the coach had not. Paul, charming as ever, smiled patiently and helped pass the time by chatting amongst the actors and crew. He and Mal Evans got some tea at the transport workers' canteen at Allsop Place, and then went down to Soho where Paul bought a uniform for the coach's conductor. The coach then finally arrived, 2 hours late, its delay blamed on the flimsy paper on which the words Magical Mystery Tour were painted, which kept falling off of the side of the coach due to the wet and windy weather. At last, the group of 43 people stood and embarked, and the tour began. Tony Barrow recalled, "I remember thinking how incredible it was that this world-class supergroup should be sitting on a bus chatting away so nonchalantly and contentedly to teenage fans whose friends would have given an arm or a leg to spend this mind-blowing week in the close quarters company of their favorite pop idols." And the Beatles would maintain this personal touch for the duration of the shoot. Let's hear from Frida Kelly, one of the first ever fan club organizers for the band, going all the way back to their Cavern days. She was incredibly surprised when she received a call from Tony Barrow a few days earlier, asking if she could take a break from sorting piles of fan mail to join the movie shoot. She, of course, said yes. Before starting to film, the boys moved people around and asked us to keep our new seats all the time so that whenever we happened to be in camera range, we'd be seen in the same part of the bus. What's more, we were to wear the same clothes all through the week, which created washing problems as the days went by. After moving Frida to her new seat, Paul, ever the flirt, handed her a box of Maltesers candy, saying, "Have these for a slim figure like yours." Filming began right away with some improvised scenes on the bus. The shooting prompt, unsurprisingly, was incredibly loose. When in doubt, film it. The group stopped for lunch at the Pied Piper, who were overwhelmed not by the enormous size of the group, but by the fact that it was the Beatles they were serving. The boys, of course, received their meals in no time, and in fact, had been presented with a second course before most of the others had been served. George looked over at some of the group and asked why they were still waiting. Then he walked right over to the kitchen and emerged shortly afterward with their lunch. In the evening, the coach arrived at its first destination, the Royal Hotel at the Den, where the party would spend the night. Tuesday would bring the first full day of shooting. The coach set off in the morning. The destination, Dartmoor village of Widdicombe, which was hosting its annual village fair. Unfortunately, on the way, the coach became stuck when attempting to cross a narrow bridge, creating a rural traffic jam in the process, and had to be backed up for over half a mile in order to get turned around. Time for a change of plans. They instead drove up to Plymouth, pausing for lunch at the Burney Inn, located within the Grand Hotel. The band would pose for photographs on Plymouth Hoe. They then boarded the coach and continued along the A38, making stops at Liskeard and Bodmin. Here, filming occurred outside the West End Dairy at 57 Higher Boar Street, where the delighted owner, Mr. D.G. Medlin, sold ice cream, fruits and lollipops to the Beatles and their party. With that, I want to take a moment here to talk about something that made the Magical Mystery Tour shoot so special. Community. All along the route, they made frequent stops at small shops and pubs. Imagine being there just another day when suddenly, unannounced, here rolls up the Beatles with a large band of colorfully dressed characters. Every stop they made, they left behind them a delighted owner with a terrific story that they would get to tell for the rest of their lives. Some even got interviewed by the local paper, such as a Mrs. Amy Smedley, who said, "They got here at lunchtime and shot some film outside our shop. Then all four came inside to have some fish and chips. I still can't believe they actually ate my fish and chips." Adorable. They then shot on Powell Road, And it was here that the scene that featured at the beginning of the film, where the character, Jolly Jimmy Johnson, portrayed by Derek Royal, welcomed everyone aboard the coach. The final stop of the day was to be the seaside town of Newquay, where it was publicized the Beatles would be staying at the Victoria Hotel. Pandemonium, of course, ensued, with the local newspaper writing, "Quest and staff at the Hotel Victoria, Newquay, and customers from the bars jumped over walls, broke down hedges, and trampled flower beds to get a view of the Beatles when their coach drew into the hotel drive-in just before lunch yesterday." But the Beatles were then shuttled to their real destination for the night, the Atlantic Hotel, where only about a dozen or so very clever, or very lucky, fans stood in wait, versus the mob back at the Victoria. They would end up staying at the hotel for the next 3 days. In the morning, the Beatles and a portion of the cast traveled to Watergate Bay, a beach 5 miles from the Atlantic Hotel. The Beatles were each filmed looking through a telescope, though this footage never ended up being used. It was also at this beach that they filmed a scene that did end up making the final cut, but ended up being removed by the BBC due to it being deemed unsuitable for viewers. The scene was of Aunt Jessie and Buster Bloodvessel having a romantic moment on the beach. When they returned to the hotel, John directed the next scene, with assistance from George. The sequence filmed was a scene where Happy Nat the Rubber Man chased bikini-clad women around the swimming pool. According to Tony Barrows, fan club secretaries who happened to have brought suitably brief swimwear in their baggage and recently recruited local girls, shivering a little in their bikinis, were joined at the pool by the obliging female partners of 1 or 2 Fleet Street reporters who had fetched them down from London for the ride. As John, comfortably wrapped up in a warm sheepskin lined jacket, gave everyone last-minute instructions and told his camera director what he wanted, the lineup of poor near-naked girls nursed their hardening goosebumps and huddled in a row against the brick wall which scarcely sheltered them from the bite of a chilly sea breeze. It wasn't all good fun, you see. Well, not for the girls anyway. One of these girls recruited was the very young 15-year-old Judith Rogers, who shares the following account. "I ended up sitting on George Harrison's lap in the foyer for about half an hour. He told me how much he hated being followed and chased everywhere by fans because it was scary. He said he was happy to talk to fans for as long as they wanted, if they just wouldn't scream all the time. Go ahead and make of that what you will." The chasing scene would later end up being scrapped. Meanwhile, Paul and Ringo Starr took the coach and most of the passengers to Porth. During the ride, Ringo and Aunt Jessie improvised an argument for the cameras. It was on this excursion that cast member Sylvia Nightingale noticed that Ringo's trousers were splitting in a, quote, embarrassing place. She pointed this out to him, and according to her, he said, "Can you sew them up for me?" I did so, to the astonishment of fans peering through the coach windows. In the late afternoon, on the beach at Porth, Paul was filmed walking and cycling on a tandem with little George the photographer.
And as we said earlier, our girl reporter Miranda Ward accompanied the Beatles on their magical mystery tour. And as a special scoop for Seen and Heard, Miranda speaks with George Harrison now about the magic tour and Beatles film plans.
Who had the original idea for the magical mystery tour?
I think Paul had the idea and wrote a song called Magical Mystery Tour. We want everybody to be able to freak out, as it were. But we don't have frightened, some people get a bit frightened when, like Day in the Life of that record, when the music suddenly goes strange and they don't know what it is. And the natural thing when people don't know about something, they tend to fear it. So we don't want them to be puzzled by what's going on. So this way we can do, it can freak out a little bit. But it's the excuse is that it's a magical mystery tour. We don't have to say everything, otherwise then there's no point in people watching it.
On Thursday, they started the day by filming 2 different scenes in a large cornfield not far from Watergate Bay. The first of these, where a number of passengers cram into a small tent, does make a brief appearance in the film. But the second scene, depicting George meditating in the middle of a field to his song Blue Jay Way, while wearing an oversized blue jacket, did not. Later in the day, the Beatles were invited by friend and musician Spencer Davis, who was vacationing in the area, to a local pub. Let's hear from Spencer. While we'd been chatting during the day, I invited Paul back to the pub in Perranporth for a drink. So that night, I'm sitting in the bar when in walks Paul and Ringo. The punters in the pub just couldn't believe it. Paul, being the sort of character he is, just grins at everybody, shouts out, "Evening all," and then installs himself at the piano where he sat, belting out pub songs all evening with everybody singing along until about 2 in the morning. That was such a great night. In the morning, the group waved goodbye to the Atlantic Hotel and made their way back down to London. Sylvia Nightingale recalls, "I must have shown my misery this morning because John said, 'Don't we look 'appy then?'" And now from Barbara King. Suddenly it was Friday. All of us girls felt a sinking feeling because it would soon be over and we'd be back to reality. No more magic, no more mystery, no more dreamy Beatles. We all sang and drank beer from bottles as the bus rolled along toward London. Some of us tried to get the boys to sing their songs, but they stuck to the old-timers. Upon arrival in Surrey, John, George, and Ringo departed. Paul would stay on the coach until it reached London. The first week of filming for Magical Mystery Tour was now complete. Far from taking a break though, the Beatles went down to Chapel Studios the next day to work on Paul's Your Mother Should Know, a classic McCartney Music Hall ditty, and recorded 11 takes that included Paul singing a guide vocal while playing the harmonium, though none of these would end up being used for the final version. The next week of shooting for Magical Mystery Tour began at Raymond Revue Bar Strip Club in London's Soho district. The scene in question involved the Beatles and their fellow male travelers from the coach trip watching Jan Carson, one of the club's performers, and the rest of the band perform Death Cab for Cutie. Jan Carson had been casted by the Beatles sometime prior, with Tony Bramwell leading the auditions. He recalled, "For me, the most bizarre moments were the 2 days I spent auditioning a room full of strippers from Raymond's Revue Bar in Soho, while John and George ogled them. Strictly in the cause of art, Paul Raymond, the emperor of strip clubs, joined in enthusiastically, lining up his best girls and being as helpful as possible. We narrowed it down to one, Jan Carson. I got her to repeatedly strip while the Bonzos played Death Cab for Cutie over and over again in camp impersonations of Elvis, dressed in silver sequined suits. The shoot was scheduled to begin at 6 a.m. I have read that it was delayed due to the performing group, the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band's instruments being stolen the night before. However, I have not seen this corroborated from any first-hand accounts. Rather, according to Alastair Taylor, the shoot was delayed due to the cinema trade's union requirements. Taylor said, "We began on Monday, 18 September at 6 a.m. That is early. We had problems almost immediately when 2 representatives of the cinema trades union arrived and threatened to close us down unless we employed the correct number of staff. The whole idea of the project was to operate with a minimum crew, but these jokers were about to saddle us with 32 technicians and ancillary staff. We never saw most of them, but the rules and regulations stipulated 32 staff, and we had to employ 32 staff if we wanted to finish the film. It was ridiculous. But the shoot went on, and prior to the final cut, Paul would edit in over Jan's bare breast a big placard that read, "Censored," quite aware that the BBC was not going to allow a pair of boobs on the television sets. Finished now were the days of on-location shoots of travel and merriment, as the Beatles would spend the rest of the week filming on sets located not at a film studio, but an army base, specifically West Malling Air Station. The pandemonium would die down for once, because the base, as you could imagine, was not open to the public. Located some 50-odd miles away from their homes, rather than make the commute, the Beatles opted to stay at the Danes Hotel in Maidstone. The scene to be tackled on this day was a John Lennon invention, a nauseatingly hilarious scene in which John, playing a pencil-mustachioed waiter, continually dumps spaghetti on Aunt Jessie's plate using a shovel, in a truly revolting scene. The I Am the Walrus sequence may be the film's strongest. Much of the credit, of course, goes to John's composition, but the imagery of the scene itself is iconic, with the military bases, stark gray concrete, contrasting brilliantly with the elaborate and surreal costuming of the Beatles and the Eggmen. Paul would recall, at West Malling Air Station, there were big, tall concrete structures that we could get people up on the top of, waving their arms. We gave people rubber egghead skull caps. The animal masks were rented from Eric Glendhill's Zoo Theater. The Beatles then walked on over to Hangar 3 for the next scene, taking place inside of the magician's laboratory, which I have to imagine that Magic Alex had some influence on. On Thursday, the first sequence for George's Blue Jay Way was filmed, another sterling example of the Beatles and their team's eye for style and imagery, as George sits upon the pavement in a shroud of fog, before him in chalk, a keyboard, and the phrase, 2 wives and kid to support. The prior day's exertion must have done a number on George, as he stayed home on this day, bedridden with the flu, sitting here in Flu Jay Way. Poor George. Invited to the air base this day was comic actor and friend of the band, Victor Spinetti. I'd worked with the Beatles in their previous movies, so John wrote to me and asked if I would be the courier in Magical Mystery Tour. I was busy doing a play, Oh What a Lovely War, in London, so I had to turn it down, but John still wanted me to be involved, so he got me to drive down to West Malling Aerodrome for the day and do a little drill sergeant routine with Paul. One lovely thing was that when we broke for lunch, they had set aside 20 minutes for anybody who wanted to meditate, which I did. It was a lovely calm moment in the middle of the schedule, and they were all into that since they'd been with the Maharishi. The filming was unusual in as much as it wasn't done in lots of short takes like a normal movie. They filmed long sequences, and they improvised as they went along. At one point, John spotted a stuffed cow, and he just decided there and then to have it in the shot. They were making it up as they went along. Next to be filmed was the scene in which Jolly Jimmy welcomes those inside the magic tent to watch Blue Jay Way. And lastly was a scene for the beginning of the film in which Ringo walks into a shop and purchases a ticket for the Magical Mystery Tour. The segment was shot in a real shop, a town news agency in West Malling, and had been arranged just earlier in the day. It came as a complete surprise to me when their producer bloke turned up and asked if I minded them using my shop to film in. They wanted to shoot during the afternoon, but that's my busiest period on a Friday. So, I said that they were welcome to come back after closing time. On Saturday, they would film the chaotic and surreal Magical Mystery Tour marathon sequence, requiring a number of unusual extras, including a rugby team, 10 children, 6 miniature wrestlers, and 3 vicars. The final scene filmed at the West Malling Air Station was to be the largest production for the film so far. The scene in question is what Paul called the Busby Berkeley ending, and featured the Beatles descending down a ballroom staircase set to Paul's Your Mother Should Know. Needed for the scene was a full-size dancing team, and Peggy Spencer was to be the lucky troop leader.
A spectacular dance in a rather different way, the tango, by the Frank and Peggy Spencer formation team.
As on one evening, she received a call from who else but Paul McCartney. Here's Peggy. I thought it was someone pulling my leg. He said, Peggy, I've had a dream. I dreamt of a white staircase leading to heaven, with a white piano at the top, the Beatles in white tailcoats, followed by dancers in beautiful white dresses. Can you set it up for me? I said, yes. Peggy choreographed a traditional waltz routine for her dancers, but when she arrived at the shoot some days earlier and first heard Your Mother Should Know, the choreography had to be changed. He hit play on this battered old tape and it played Your Mother Should Know. I said to Paul, this is not a waltz. A waltz has 3 beats to a bar, and you've done 4. We re-choreographed the waltz for the music and showed the Beatles how to kick. We walked to the back of the stage to climb to the top of the stairs that we would come down and realized no one had built steps to get to the top. Filming was cancelled for the day, but we came back a day or 2 later and filmed the video. But even then, things didn't go off without a hitch. Let's hear from Alistair Taylor. The final scene had the Beatles resplendent in wonderful white suits with a whole mass of people in this hangar going up a big white staircase. The boys kept their outfits a secret because they wanted to surprise everyone, and they certainly did that. We invited all the people from miles around, and thousands came. The idea was that the four boys appeared for one last time in the Magical Mystery Tour bus with a great crowd following them like the Pied Piper of Hamelin. There were grannies and women with babes in arms and gangs of teddy boys. All sorts had arrived. We were just setting up this big finale when suddenly there was a power cut and every light in the place went out. It was Sunday afternoon. We needed another generator and we got one just in time, just as the crowd were losing interest and starting to drift away. We were just ready when suddenly every light went out again. More people left, and by the end there were about 25 of us trying to make ourselves look like the sort of crowd you usually see at Wembley. If you look very carefully, you can see me, Cynthia, little Julian, Big Mal, Neil, and a few others desperately trying to make ourselves look like a crowd. And with that, the significant bulk of the Magical Mystery Tour shoot was now complete. Time to get back to the studio. It was time to put some real takes down for Paul's The Fool on the Hill, and it was to be a social day in the studio, as two Japanese journalists, reporter Rumiko Hoshika and photographer Ko Hasebe from the magazine Music Life, came by to take photos and record some interviews. Rumiko would say, "In September 1967, I was in London again at a recording session as John and Paul worked together to finish up lyrics to The Fool on the Hill. I was not the only Japanese woman in the studio that day. Also sitting in a corner of the studio was Ono Yoko." Wait, what was that? Yes, you heard correctly. Yoko Ono was in the studio today, some 8 months before her and John dove headfirst into each other. Interesting stuff. The Beatles recorded 4 takes of the basic rhythm track today, including harmonica from both John and George. Overdubbed later was the recorder we see Paul pictured with, as well as his lead vocal.
See the world spinning round.
On the next day, numerous overdubs were added, including acoustic guitars and bass. George Martin wasn't present on this day, so engineer Ken Scott had to take control of the session, despite it being his second day on the Beatles' job. Co-engineer Richard Lush recalled, "He was so nervous that it was just unbelievable. He was saying, 'What lights do I use?' and 'What do I do?' I really felt for him that day." The Beatles always put a bit of pressure on their engineers. They expected you to be there, doing your job, but there wasn't a lot of thanks. The workaholic Beatles kept at it the next day with significant overdubs for John's I Am the Walrus. A number of string and brass musicians were brought in who played together in the lower registers to produce the haunting arrangement we hear throughout the song. The superb score was of course written by George Martin. The strange vocal chanting and backing in the song was produced not solely by the Beatles, but also a 16-person choir. The idea of using voices was a good one, said George Martin. We got in the Mike Sam singers.
Things impossible I have found, for when my chin is on the ground, I pick myself up, dust myself off, start all over again.
Very commercial people, and so alien to John that it wasn't true. But in the score, I simply orchestrated the laughs and noises. John was delighted with it. Also on this day, John elected to participate in a small conceptual art piece by Yoko, subscribing to her postal art event, 13 Days Do-It-Yourself Dance Festival. Each morning, participants received a short instructional message. On Thursday, they would record additional overdubs for their group instrumental, Flying, including Mellotron from John and a guitar piece from George. By the time a song reached the remixing stage, it was usually considered complete, perhaps just needing a few small mixing touches to finish it off. However, with I Am the Walrus, John continued to insert his own creative flourishes. On Remix 22, as the song neared an end, mixed in was a live feed from radio, jumping between stations before settling on BBC's third program, on which was playing a production of Shakespeare's The Tragedy of King Lear.
Oh, untimely death. Death.
I know thee well. A serviceable villain, as duteous to the vices of thy mistress as badness would desire.
What? Is he dead?
Sit you down, father. Rest you.
Afterward, John and Paul got to work on Your Mother Should Know. They scrapped the remake that had been done earlier in the month.
Let's all get up and dance to a song that was
and jumped back to their initial rhythm tracks from late August, overdubbing organ and bass guitar and calling it a rap. Later in the day, John and George appeared on The Frost Program with David Frost in an interview conducted entirely on the topic of transcendental meditation.
I know damn well I've had it there before. I just haven't. I've only used it on what I term good days, you know, when everything's gone well. And then I found more energy because it's been going well. Well, with meditation, I find that if it's not too good a day, I can still sort of get the same amount of...
And can you link the two in any way? I mean, is it true of any day of meditation is equally good? I mean,
yeah. Well, the worst days I have on meditation are better than the worst days I had before without it.
Do you find that, George?
It's all the energy is latent within everybody. It's there anyway. The meditation is just a natural process of being able to contact that.
All this while, editing had begun on Magical Mystery Tour, and the Beatles began to realize that their incredibly loose, slapdash outline for the film had left quite a few holes in the final product. On October 1st, they returned to the West Malling Air Station, where they needed to shoot some additional pickup shots with the coach. There would be more stray shoots to come. It was to be a very late session for the Beatles tonight, as they didn't come into the studio until 10 p.m. And a new song was brought in today, Paul's Hello Goodbye, a song he wrote in his home on Cavendish Avenue. Let's read a bit of writing from Alastair Taylor, who claims to have been there on the day of origin, and perhaps even served as the inspiration, after asking Paul just how he writes his songs. Alastair wrote, Paul marched me into the dining room, where he had a marvelous old hand-carved harmonium. Come and sit at the other end of the harmonium. You hit any note you like on the keyboard. Just hit it, and I'll do the same. Now whenever I shout out a word, you shout the opposite, and I'll make up a tune. You watch. It'll make music. Black, he started. White, I replied. Yes. No. Good. Bad. Hello. Goodbye. I wonder whether Paul really made up that song as he went along, or whether it was running through his head already. I'm personally of the mind that Paul did have the song in his head already. Maybe he just wanted to flaunt a little bit. Of the song, Paul himself said, there are Geminian influences here, I think. It's such a deep theme in the universe. Duality. Man, woman, black, white, ebony, ivory, high, low, right, wrong, up, down, hello, goodbye. That it was a very easy song to write. And while Paul may put it so poetically, John would later describe it as 3 minutes of contradictions and meaningless juxtapositions, which, while I usually side against John's bitter interpretations, I do think his description of the song is a little bit more accurate than Paul's. They spent 14 takes getting the best rhythm track down. The somewhat strange reprisal ending was present from the very first take. Though it wasn't until the mixing stage that the correct sound fell into place. According to Paul, from the recording aspect, I remember the end bit where there's the pause and it goes, We had those words and we had this whole thing recorded, but it didn't sound quite right. And I remember asking Jeff Emmerich if we could really whack up the echo on the tom-toms. And we put this echo full up on the tom-toms, and it just came alive. We Phil Spectored it. The next couple of weeks were to be slow by Beatles standards. On the 9th of October, John would celebrate his 27th birthday. This day also marked, coincidentally, the last day of Yoko's previously mentioned postal art event, 13 Days Do-It-Yourself Dance Festival. The final message, sent to John on his birthday, read, "Color yourself. Wait for the spring to come. Let us know when it comes." On October 17th came a memorial for deceased band manager and beloved friend Brian Epstein. The Beatles had not attended his funeral on August 29th, which might sound cold on its face, but was for good reason, as they wanted to allow his family privacy and knew full well the spectacle that would be created by their attendance. It has been quoted that the rabbi at Brian's funeral very cruelly remarked to the congregation that Brian Epstein was a symbol of the malaise of our generation. If that is indeed the case, then it is a blessing that this service was officiated by Rabbi Louis Jacobs, who instead praised Epstein for encouraging young people to sing of love and peace rather than war and hatred. And then the next day, the Beatles attended another event, this time the premiere for Richard Lester's How I Won the War, which had featured John as Private Gripweed. On the 19th and 20th, they recorded additional overdubs for The Fool on the Hill and Hello Goodbye, bringing in flautists and viola players. It took some time to get the viola arrangement correct, and it was once again one of those Paul at the piano, playing what he wanted, with George Martin standing by, translating. During the last bit of the day, Paul wiped a short guitar solo he had put down for Hello Goodbye, and replaced it with the heavily echoed The Fool on the Hill was now finished and slated for inclusion in the Magical Mystery Tour film, but there was not yet any suitable footage for the song. No worries. Dynamic duo, Paul McCartney and Mal Evans on the case. They brought along cameraman Aubrey Dewar and boarded a plane to the beautiful city of Nice in France, where Paul envisioned this dreamlike scene occurring. On arrival, heading through customs, Paul realized he had brought neither his passport nor any money. Now this is serious business. There are a number of strict guidelines in place here. This could be a matter of national security after all. But as you could imagine, the customs agents could simply not stand up against Paul's foolproof argument of, "You know who I am, so why do you need to see a photograph of me in a passport?" They let it slide. This time, the trio made their way to a hotel and hired a taxi driver who they instructed to wake them at 3:30 the next morning, as they intended to shoot at sunrise. Paul tells the whole story. "We just asked the local taxi driver, where is a good place to see the sunrise from? Nice was fairly easily accessible. It had good mountain scenery, and I figured we might get a good clear sunrise down there. We all piled in the taxi and drove up into the mountains behind Nice. We unpacked the stuff from the boot, loaded up his camera, set up the tripod where we knew the sun would rise, and waited in the freezing cold." In the first couple of days of November, it had been decided, despite John's protest, that Hello Goodbye was to be the A-side of the next single, with I Am the Walrus as its B-side. While I imagine at least 90% of us consider Walrus to be the much stronger track, we will come to see shortly that, financially at least, placing Hello Goodbye on the A-side was the correct decision. And then on the 3rd, the final bit of filming for Magical Mystery Tour took place. Sequences for George's Blue Jay Way. The segments were taken in Ringo's backyard, where each band member was filmed miming with a white cello, as well as playing some football. Inside, our hulking hero, Mal Evans, was filmed shirtless, with footage taken at the airbase projected against his bare chest. On November 10th, the Beatles arrived at London's Savile Theatre to film promotional video for the upcoming Hello Goodbye single. They mimed to the song wearing their iconic Sgt. Pepper suits, and also filmed short cutaway shots of them wearing their 1963 collarless suits. Hula girls were brought in for the song's reprisal ending. The Beatles were incredibly busy the next few weeks, though there's only so much detail we can get into. There were quite a few balls up in the air. First off, They were still editing the hours and hours of Magical Mystery Tour footage into something that could be called a movie. Also, of course, mixing and banding together the loose groups of songs they currently had lying around. This is where things get a little strange, as the work was slated to be released as a double EP in the UK, but as an album in the US. As added were a number of single tracks including Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane, Baby You're a Rich Man, All You Need Is Love, and Hello Goodbye. Finally, it was the beginning of what would prove an unfortunate, overambitious business venture for the Beatles, the whole of the Apple conglomerate, starting with the opening of their Apple Boutique, conceptualized by Paul as a beautiful place where beautiful people can buy beautiful things. On the 24th came the release of Hello Goodbye in the UK. As teased earlier, the song would prove to be a smash hit and would be the Beatles' most successful UK single since She Loves You. In the background, however, BBC quietly banned I Am the Walrus from playing on the airwaves. They did not like the inclusion of the word knickers in the song. 3 days later came the somewhat controversial US release of the Magical Mystery Tour album. Although this was only controversial on the Beatles' end, who did not consider it a real album, rather a bastardization of the Magical Mystery Tour soundtrack, with some already released music thrown on there. This did not matter one bit to the general public, however, as it generated the highest level of initial sales of any album to date, and netted the label more than 8 million in just 3 weeks. Despite coming off the back of the unbelievably heralded Sgt. Pepper's, the album was very well received. Nick Logan of NME wrote that the Beatles were at it again, stretching pop music to its limits. This is the Beatles out there in front, and the rest of us in their wake. Hit Parader would say, the beautiful Beatles do it again, widening the gap between them and 80 Silly and other groups. Mike John of Saturday Review would even go as far as distinguishing Magical Mystery Tour as the Beatles' best work yet, superior to Sgt. Pepper in emotion and depth, and distinguished by its description of the Beatles' acquired Hindu philosophy. But you can't please everyone, and negative reviews of brilliant music are always a bit of fun. Let's hear a couple. Rex Reed of Hi-Fi Stereo Review wrote a scathing critique in which he derided the group's farcical, stagnant, helpless bellowing, and confused musical ideas. He said that exchanging drugs for meditation as their subject matter had left the Beatles totally divorced from reality, and he especially ridiculed I Am the Walrus on an LP he deemed a platter of phony, pretentious, overcooked tripe. And Robert Christgau of Esquire would write that he considered 3 of the new songs to be disappointing, among which The Fool on the Hill may be the worst song the Beatles have ever recorded. Harsh. I would love to hear your thoughts on the album. Some consider it superior to Pepper, and some consider it a bit too loose of a collection to rise to those heights. For me personally, I adore many of the songs, and any album with Walrus, Strawberry Fields, and Penny Lane is going to be a wonderful listen. But as a very slight purist, I still prefer the cohesive efforts of quite a few other albums more. Let me know what you think. We associate it most with their Mop Top days, but at this point the Beatles were still recording annual Christmas messages for their fan club. On the 28th, they came into the studio and did just that, recording a song attributed to all 4 Beatles named Christmas Time Is Here Again.
Christmas time is o'er, and your bonny clay is through. I'll be bristling to you people, all the best from me to you. Christmas time is here again. Christmas time is here again.
We now head into December. The 5th would mark the opening of the Beatles' Apple Boutique, where a launch party and fashion show would be hosted. Invitations were sent out, reading, "Come at 7:46. Fashion show at 8:16. These oddly specific times had been chosen by John. The shop's colorful exterior was created by the Fool Design Collective. The group had previously worked with the Beatles, designing the band's clothing for the 1967 television broadcast of All You Need Is Love, and the I Am the Walrus segment of Magical Mystery Tour. Appointed to manage the shop were Patty Harrison's younger sister, Ginny Boyd, and John Lennon's longtime friend, Pete Shotton, who describes how he became involved. Later that evening, I tried to pin John down as to what my role in Apple might consist of. Well, he said, we're planning to open a clothing shop for starters. Eventually we'll have a chain of Apple boutiques all over the world, but the first one's gotta be in London. Since you know all about shops, why don't you just run that? But I don't know anything at all about boutiques, John. Well, just have a go at it, Pete. If you don't like it, then fuck it. We'll find you something else to do. That about sums up the amount of planning the Beatles put into the whole enterprise. 3 days later came the release of the somewhat awkward UK double EP version of Magical Mystery Tour. And the Beatles, specifically Paul, wanted to add a little bit extra to the whole package, seeing as it was not a complete album. So to be included within the double EP's packaging was a comprehensive booklet, offering readers a deeper dive into the Magical Mystery Tour. The contents ranged from song lyrics to color stills from the television special, captured by esteemed photographer John Kelly. In addition, it featured vibrant story illustrations drawn in the style of comic strip by Bob Gibson, known for his work as a cartoonist for the Beatles Monthly Book. We're getting close to the end now. In celebration of both the Magical Mystery Tour film and the Apple Boutique opening, the Beatles tasked the ever-humorous Alastair Taylor with arranging a Christmas party. Let's hear from him. When filming eventually ended, I thought it was back to normality, or what passed for normality in 1967. Wrong. One morning, late in November, John, Paul, George, and Ringo strode into my office. They sat on any available surface. They were grinning. John was the first to speak. Al, how about making the Beatles' Christmas party a Magical Mystery Tour party? Great idea, I said, as I tore up the plans for the original party. I expanded the guest list and chose a larger venue, and things were falling into place. 2 days later, the Beatles trooped into my office. Once again, they were grinning. This time it was Paul who spoke. Al, we have been talking. The Christmas party. We've decided to include all of the people at Apple. Is it a problem? No, I said, trying to sound casual. We now had the Beatles and Apple Magical Mystery Tour Christmas party. I was just wondering how to fit that little lot onto the invitations when George said, in fancy dress. I laughed loud and long before I realized they were serious. I hired a huge suite at the Royal Lancaster Hotel in Bayswater, and it turned out to be a fantastic evening. Paul and Jane Asher arrived dressed as Pearly King and Queen. And Lennon? He dressed up as a rocker. What else? We had a great time celebrating. It's Christmas Day. Paul and Jane have spent the entirety of December together, much of it on Paul's farm in Scotland. They are visiting with Paul's family when they announce to them all that they are now engaged. This engagement would not come to fruition. I will now read an excerpt from Hunter Davies' authorized Beatles biography. Another problem, says Paul, was that my whole existence for so long centered around a bachelor life. I didn't treat women as most people do. I've always had a lot around, even when I've had a steady girl. My life generally has always been very lax and not normal. I knew it was selfish. It caused a few rows. Jane left me once and went off to Bristol to act. I said, okay then, leave. I'll find someone else. It was shattering to be without her. When they got engaged on Christmas Day, all of these problems were in the past. Now let's be straight here. Paul slept around about as much as anyone on the face of the earth ever has. Perhaps Jane felt assured that with this engagement, Paul would go straight, and they would spend more time together, and things would work out. And it appeared that this was the case for a while, and Jane even accompanied him to India, despite her lack of enthusiasm for the Maharishi and meditation in general. But following their return, things quickly fell apart. But that was later, and today, things were good. And the next day, Paul's baby, his passion project, Magical Mystery Tour, would finally premiere before the whole of the UK on BBC One. It was not well received. The Daily Express would write, "The bigger they are, the harder they fall." And what a fall it was. The whole boring saga confirmed a long-held suspicion of mine that the Beatles are four rather pleasant young men who have made so much money that they can apparently afford to be contemptuous of the public. The Sun would also add, the BBC switchboard was overwhelmed last night by people complaining about the Beatles film Magical Mystery Tour. Some people protested that the BBC One program was incomprehensible. Maybe Magical Mystery Tour is not a good film. But being the psychedelic experience that it is, it was in no way helped by its initial airing in black and white rather than color.
And of course they showed it in black and white. And so it was hated. You know, they all had their chance then to say they've gone too far. Who do they think they are?
And John would say, what the BBC, stupid idiots, did, they showed it in black and white first. Can you imagine? And then they reviewed it in black and white. It's like reviewing a mono version of a stereo record. And yet, Paul did not quietly slink away. The next few days were spent in what could only be called a defensive but apologetic press tour, where Paul interviewed with numerous papers and appeared on the David Frost Show, the repeated sentiment being, well, maybe it's not good, but we tried.
Well, you can't say it was a success because the papers didn't like it, and that seems to be what... But I think it's all right.
My dad brought the bad news into me this morning like the figure of doom. Perhaps the newspapers are right. Perhaps we're right. We'll have to wait and see. I know it wasn't the slickest job and may have looked a bit amateur, but I still think it better that we try ourselves and that we try to present the viewers with something different from all the phony tinsel of Christmas shows. And I think revisiting the film, at the very least as a novelty, does cast a better light upon it. It is messy and amateurish, but there is a certain fascination in its encapsulation of the psychedelic period, and its unfiltered glimpse into the Beatles' creative mindsets. Undoubtedly not nearly as strong in this non-musical form, but still distinctive and sincere. This is not a normal movie. It was not made to be a normal movie. It is what it is. The Beatles, sans John, who was on vacation in Morocco, would attend a New Year's party at Celia Black's. Ringo was sent out to retrieve a piece of coal, and on his return, no one could hear his buzzer, and he was trapped outside in the freezing cold for 2 hours. And that was it for the year. 1967 marked the absolute zenith of the Beatles' influence. It was a year of prolonged creativity like perhaps never seen before. The years to follow would leave a much different mark. Want to watch the making of the White Album, including the Beatles' entire experience in India? I've got you covered, as I've already made it, although it was my first video, so the audio and voiceover aren't quite as strong. Sorry about that. Want to see more Beatles? I have a Patreon. For $1, you can watch videos early there, and for $2, you'll get exclusive content, including more casual podcast-type videos where me and my girlfriend, who is a new/first-time Beatles fan, listen and review the albums one by one from our differing perspectives. Any support you can give me on there helps me out so much. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. Thank you again for watching. Until next time.